From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Open Line.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Open Line. Glad you're with us. Doing something a little different tonight. Talking about Cuba. Happy to have with us Robby Starbuck with Latinos for Tennessee. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So, a lot to talk to you about, but let's talk 101 on Cuba. Your connection to Cuba and what is happening in Cuba right now.
Absolutely. So my family came from Cuba. My family came here shortly after the revolution in segments because, it was harder for the men to get out of Cuba. And so, like, say, my grandfather, he had to wait. My mom came very easily, but my grandfather, he had to wait a few years until the State Department would, clear them. And they wanted to come in a legal process. But it was very difficult, the situation they went through, but what we're seeing now, many decades later, is much more difficult. These people have been living through an oppressive government. We still have family there in Cuba. This government has been doing everything to really oppress life for these people who live there still. They have inadequate medical care, and they have for decades. They have inadequate access to food and have for decades. The sort of picture some people have had of Cuba is a very mistaken one, and I think that that's something that, hopefully if there's any callers that have a mistaken idea about it, I can give them some information based on having real life family there.
What's happening there now is a wave of protests, right? We're seeing protests all across the country. The government, has it shut down the internet to try and quell some of these protests? Yes,
they shut down the internet. In fact, I know, so for my own family, you and I were just talking off camera, I'm running for Congress, and so my own family can't talk to me because of that. That's how oppressive the government is there, because I've been very open about the fact that it's an oppressive communist government. And the members of my family who can talk to them, though, they haven't been able to reach them for days because of the internet shutdown. So, it's one of those things where we're kind of waiting and seeing what's going to happen, because, say, when something similar happened in Iran a few years ago, the United States helped open up an internet line. So our hope is that something like that can occur with Cuba, so that people can at least get messages out, we're safe, this is what's going on, and be able to actually get a lot of the video and photos of the protests out, because that's the other thing. While we've seen a lot of videos and photos of the protests, we've seen a very small percentage of them, because these are people who were able to essentially sneak these out through access points, internet access points that are very rare to have in Cuba. So it's very rare to get this stuff out during this moment in time right now, but I'm sure once it opens up, we'll kind of see the floodgates open on video and photos.
We thought what was happening in Cuba was very interesting, and so, we asked Latinos for Tennessee to send somebody over to talk about it. They've sent over you. You are running for Congress. That's not necessarily why you're here. You're definitely a more conservative voice. That's fine as well. And so we can talk about that as the conversation progresses. But as far as what's happening there now, how likely is it that there will be change in Cuba?
Well, that's tough, because it's tied, obviously it's very interconnected to our politics. So it really depends how we treat Cuba in this moment, because the Cuban government, essentially, they have needs, and right now I think the first thing that I would have a difference with is we loosen sanctions on Venezuela to allow Venezuela then is allowed to give money over to the communist government in Cuba. I think that's a wrong decision, because the Cuban government has given us no indication that when we give them money or we give them help, that they will actually have that come down to the people. They haven't traditionally in the past, and they've only given us sort of evidence that they won't in the future. I did like that we've offered to give third-party help and to send a third party in there for medical help and things along those lines, but we also know Cuba won't take the offer, and that's on their government, and that's why I don't think we should be loosening sanctions in Venezuela to have them help by proxy, because, essentially Cuba's fear has always been, we don't want to let anybody in here because you give a taste of freedom, freedom's kind of addictive, and it's going to lead to more protests. So they've never wanted third-party help even from the U.S. because they fear the U.S. will implant people in there and things along those lines.
And U.S. is always kind of the bad guy.
Right? That's sort of the staging all around the world, is they like to frame us as the bad guy, but we're also the people everybody calls for help when they really need help.
Right.
So. And
so the government would say, I think they're saying, right, some of these protesters are actually funded or backed by the U.S. government. That's one of the bad things they say about them.
That's one of the things they say. Another thing that they say, even here, the narrative about what's going on in Cuba is kind of flawed. I've heard, the White House say that this is about COVID and about COVID vaccines. I watched every protest video that's available, and there's two words that I never heard any of those protesters saying. It's COVID and COVID vaccines. This is about decades of oppression. This is about decades of not being able to feed kids and their kids being taken from their parents and being indoctrinated in schools. This is about decades of, like, for instance, you know, farmers can't keep their own food from their farm. If they keep too much food beyond their rationed amount, they'll go to jail. If a dad is at home and their wife and kids are hungry, they can't go fish and bring fish home. They'll be jailed for that. This is decades of this type of oppressive behavior, and it's resulted in this. Now, if you ask me where did this start, this is a youth-led movement, and it really started in the music community there with a lot of the young people, but this has sort of infected everything else. And where did that spur from? I do think the internet has a lot to do with it, because they haven't had internet access anywhere near as long as we have, and I think that's why they went for shutting down the internet, aside from just wanting to get the videos out. I think they're going to try for not having any internet, because I think a lot of people within the government there seem to believe that the internet expose these people to ideas about freedom in the United States that have become popularized in the youth movement very similarly to how the revolution popularized through the youth movements when it initially happened, when Castro and Che Guevara were seen like rock stars in Cuba. That was a product of a similar sort of phenomenon. And so I think they are afraid, because this is very different from previous protests in Cuba in that regard. It was never really youth-led in the past. It was mostly older people. So this is sort of a new direction, new thing that they're seeing. So,
and what I heard was, yeah, young people. So these protests are young people. They're all across the country. We're seeing some pictures now. These are different than what we've seen in the past. I heard people were upset about, you know, the final straw was COVID, but certainly young people are fed up with everything. You know, they've been locked up for a long time, and they're fed up. I heard there were some videos that showed maybe some of Castro's sons or something living the high life, and everyone else is struggling for food, and that kind of fueled it. Is that accurate?
So there is some accuracy here. It's not just sons. It's really the whole family and the whole sort of the upper echelons of the Communist Party. You know, everybody involved there is living really well, and there's been some online accounts and photos and videos that some of the people have seen. Again, why the internet is so dangerous to them, because you see the truth, and that's the fear of every tyrannical government like theirs, where they rule with an iron fist, is that the minute people get a taste of reality or a taste of freedom, they're going to want more. I mean, it is addictive. The minute you're allowed to be free versus be oppressed, that's something I think everybody in America should be able to agree on, is that we want to be free. You know, we don't want to live like the people in Cuba are living right now. So there's definitely a piece of that in there, and I think that the internet is ultimately the starting point of this, because that's where they got their taste of freedom.
And so the internet is new there, is that right?
It's fairly new in terms of wide circulation in Cuba. It really started to circulate like really widely, I would say probably like 7-8 years ago. Somewhere along those lines started to get wider circulation. And so, and they did have a lot of, you know, attempts to sort of block certain websites and things along those lines that you see in the Middle East. And they've found ways around that in recent years, which I think has been a big problem for the government there. The use of VPNs and things along those lines have allowed those young people to have full access to the internet.
And so the government then comes in, shuts down the internet, and is that going to work? I mean, can the government keep the internet shut down, or can the United States help open that back up? I mean, they're just 90 miles off
the United States can, and you know, while I may be a Republican, I would give Joe Biden a lot of credit if he did that, if he would go and bring the internet up for these people. It's what we did in Iran previously, I think 2017. DeSantis has called on him to do that. I hope that he really considers that, because time is of the essence with it. You know, it's sort of like if you drag this out 2 weeks to give them the internet back, it's sort of intentionally sucking energy out of what's happening there and allows the Cuban government in darkness to go after all these things. Because here's the thing, a lot of these protest leaders are being arrested right now, you know, and we've seen videos where they're pulling children out of homes too, of protest leaders. So they're separating the children from the parents and then arresting the parents. In some cases, the mothers have nothing to do with it, but they're being arrested anyways. There's a video where the mom's talking about that. And, you know, so these are things that I'm concerned about. If we wait too long, we're essentially deciding for them what is going to happen here by sucking the energy out of it and allowing them in darkness to arrest these people.
And I'm fascinated by all this, and I hope the viewers are. But all right, Cuba is how many people? 16 million?
It's a little bit less than that.
So a little bit less than 16. We're not talking about a huge country, and it's not even a big country, right? It's been under this dictatorship for how long? Give us a quick history.
Since really, I mean, in terms of them fully having power, I would say early 60s, so 62, something like that, there was a period of time where it was shaky, you know, where you could say they had power, but they weren't fully out. I mean, one thing people forget about Castro is that when he rose to power, he never said, hey, I'm a communist. In fact, when he was asked about it by the media did a good job pressuring him back then, and they would ask him over and over, and he kept saying, I'm not a communist, I'm not a Marxist, I'm a humanist. I believe in free healthcare, free education for all. I believe in social justice for all. That video is still out there of him doing that, and it's remarkable because the minute he consolidated power, he came out and said, I'm a Marxist. We're a communist government named at the Communist Party. So those early 60s, they've had that stranglehold since then, and I think especially since Castro has passed away, this is added to this youth movement feeling like this is our chance to move on from this oppressive regime and have freedom and have democratic elections.
So Castro passes away, and who's actually in charge now? Well,
first his brother was in charge, and now they have a new president that just came in. His name is Raul too, just like his brother. So it's sort of, they're handpicked by the Castro family. Castro's brother is still alive, and the new president was handpicked by them.
And why is this? All right, why should somebody in Tennessee care? Why should we in Tennessee care what's happening in Cuba?
That's a good question, because, you know, even myself, I have to ask this question if it's just my familial connection that makes me care about this, and it's really not. It's the fact this country 90 miles away from the United States of America. Okay, so if we're ever going to be concerned about what's happening outside of our country, if we're ever going to have that lens outside of our country to look at what's going on in the world, this should be the places closest to us first. You know, Mexico, Cuba. Cuba's closer to us than Hawaii is in the mainland, you know, so you got to think about it that way. So to know that this sort of human rights violation is happening so closely, we have to examine ourselves as a country. Are we okay with this? Are we going to be okay with this happening right next to us? Outside of that, we also have to be concerned about, are there similarities here with what's happened in Cuba and situations we're facing now in elections? Are there similarities to when Castro rose to power and things we see happening now? What rights are we willing to give up that people there may have given up that we may want to take a second look at in terms of, are we really willing to give these rights up because they could lead to a bad place, whether people have good intentions now or not? And so I think that there's a litany of reasons why we should care from our own rights and how this could reflect our own choices in, you know, the coming years. And also, are we okay with this happening right next to us? Because, you know, I think that if this was happening in a place like Mexico, all of a sudden the government was behaving this way, we would have a very different, shocked sort of reaction to it, and I think it would still be the #1 story in the world. But because Cuba's been so oppressive for so long, it's easy to sort of let it fall onto the back burner because we just assume, well, they've been like this forever.
Right. And if it were happening in, I don't know, over in Asia, somewhere far away, we probably wouldn't be too concerned about it.
Well, it's not as much of a national security concern. That's the other thing is Cuba's a major national security concern. Being so close, 90 miles away from Florida, they have an access point to attack our country that if they ally with the wrong people or do the wrong things, they can be very dangerous. And I think everybody knows that from their previous association with the Soviet Union. So, you know, that has to be a concern as well.
Florida is also very important. A big Cuban community in Florida. Florida is obviously an important state in the presidential elections. So both sides want to make that voting group happy. And I would think both sides want the people of Cuba to be free. I don't know why a side would say, I don't want the people of Cuba to be free. So how do, and I know you're coming at it from a conservative perspective, but how are both sides kind of playing this, and what's at stake with the voters in Florida?
So with the voters in Florida, and I'm saying this outside of my political lens, actually, because I want to be very fair on this issue, because the issue matters more than my race. And so there's certain things I really wish Biden would do. I think he's been really slow to react here, and I think that's a mistake because it allows Cuba to do the things they're doing right now in darkness. And I don't think that we should ever, you know, hope for that to happen anywhere in the world. And we should do everything we can to stop that from happening in the world. So I worry about that. But in terms of, you know, the two sides' reactions, you know, somebody like Ron DeSantis has, I think, played this right the entire time. He's sort of been right on top of it, on the ball, saying we need to bring the internet back, #1. #2, we need to cut off Venezuela from being able to send money, guns, extra people there, because they've flown in shipments and we don't know what they are ever since this happened. And there were Cuban officials on these flights as well. So that has to be a concern on top of that. And I do think, you know, he's got a great point there. We should be cutting off Venezuela's access at this point because they're only going to make things happen that are not a positive thing. I think we all know that about Venezuela. They haven't exactly been an upright actor in the past. So, you know, that's on that side. On the Democratic side, you know, it's just, I wish I could tell you there was one thing where I'm really happy they did X because I want to be fair to them, but they really, from the very minute they started, they didn't tell the truth about why this is going on. You know, this was not just about COVID.
What would their motive be? And now Obama was trying to open Cuba back up, right? We were trying to more normalize our relationship.
Which is something Cubans are opposed to. Okay. The vast majority, I should say, because there's obviously a couple of stragglers that won't, but the vast majority of Cubans are opposed to dropping the embargo. And the reason for that is because we understand that what's going on with the embargo, and this has sort of been the argument from the left, so I'm glad you brought that up, is they say the embargo is causing this. The embargo doesn't do those things to farmers that I said. You know, they're not stealing food from farmers. They're not arresting fathers if they go out and fish too much food. They're not taking money away from people. And one of the things I've heard over the past few years from some politicians is praising Cuba for sending doctors all over the world. It's labor trafficking what they're doing. They send doctors and they actually get paid. The Cuban government takes the money and doesn't pay the doctors. Everybody in Cuba makes somewhere around $20 a month. So this whole idea with the embargo, all of the oppressive actions that are actually, you know, hurting regular Cubans' lives, they're coming from the government. They're not coming from an embargo. Our embargo is stopping the government from profiting off of tourism, essentially. And so... Yeah,
the concern is that if we lifted the embargo, then the government would just enrich itself.
Enrich itself, exactly. And they won't carry that on to the people. And we've seen that in the past whenever they've extracted wealth from anywhere in the world. They've kept the money for themselves. And you see that in the opulence of the lives of the Castro family and the other people that are close to the regime. So I think that's a concern with the embargo is clearly that's the reason we feel the way we do. The other thing is money, remitting money there. Okay, so if I tried to send $100, which is illegal now, but say somebody tried to, okay, the Cuban government would take 90 off the top, okay? The other 10 would go through other people who take transaction fees, and you would end up getting maybe $5 to a normal person. They won't even allow you to do that, though.
I think Biden said somewhere he's trying to stop that, right? He wants to stop them shaving money that's sent. Yeah, Cuban Americans send home, make it directly into the hands of their families without the regime taking a cut.
That would be fantastic, but we would have to be there.
How do you
exactly, we would have to be there to do that. And so unless he's advocating for us to be there, it's nice words, but it's not practical. And that's sort of the problem, because he opposes any sort of actual, you know, intervention in that way. So there's no functional way to make sure they don't do that. Because right now, say, I was talking to actually a baseball player who went there and played in the past when we did a game between the United States and Cuba, and he said he didn't know the rules, and one day he was walking down the street from the stadium and some young men asked him for money. He handed them money. He walked down the street and he wasn't very far. He heard some noises like people were fighting. He turns around and the boys were being arrested. The young men were being arrested because they had the money. And that's how things work there. The government always gets their cut. So unless we have boots on the ground there making sure the money gets into the hand of the people and we're going to protect them, that's not going to happen, you know, and that's not what he's proposing at all. So that's sort of the thing, is like, nice words, they're great, but it has to be followed by action. You know, and some of the other things too is in terms of why they wouldn't go and tell the full truth about what's going on in Cuba is because, for instance, you know, Karen Bass was almost chosen as vice president. Okay, she was second in line after Kamala. Karen Bass was a huge fan of Fidel Castro. She actually joined a club that was a fan club of Fidel Castro where they dressed up and everything. Okay, the reason she ended up not being picked, a lot of people thought in the political world, was because of that and the fear that that would lose Florida. Obviously, that didn't end up mattering.
It couldn't help.
Yeah, it couldn't help, obviously. You know, and that Cuban voter bloc isn't just important because of the way they vote, but because they're some of the most energetic activists. You know, even here in Nashville, we just had a Cuba protest this weekend, and I mean, we filled up the pedestrian bridge with Cubans. I think most people in Nashville had no idea there was that many Cubans here. You know, so that's the thing, is a very energetic group of people who are very engaged politically. So that's some of the fear, I think, that's there, is that, you know, if you go all the way, you open up the door to all the people who have praised Cuba, you know, and there's people within the party that have praised their healthcare system, like Bernie Sanders, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Katie Porter. These people have praised the system there. This is a system, and why this is sort of offensive to me is I have family members who died in that healthcare system, not able to get treatment. I had one who had cancer, and they refused to treat her because she was a line item, and they considered her terminal, so they didn't treat, not even pain medicine. So she died in a hospital room that we still have a picture of, that his cold metal bed. There's no medical equipment in it. There's not even an IV or anything like that. And the only medicine she got was ibuprofen. It's called something else there, but ibuprofen that was brought over.
But would
to
you
her.
be suggesting that's what Bernie Sanders is praising? I mean, are you suggesting that that's what he wants?
No, it's not entirely that. It's the way that they've praised it, and he has praised the system directly, is either number one, he doesn't understand it, in which case he shouldn't be using it as an example, or number two, he's sort of fudging the truth in hopes that people don't look too deeply at it in order to sell a policy, and I think that both are dangerous. We need to tell the truth about this stuff. There's dangers in it, and you could try to sell whatever it is he's trying to sell without using the Cuban healthcare system as an example. I think that if you're trying to use that or Venezuela as an example, I think people can see why that's not a very good idea. And he did the same thing with Venezuela before Venezuela went down. He praised Venezuela repeatedly, even in an op-ed that he wrote about Venezuela. So he knows, having seen these things crash down, that these specific ones don't work. So a question really should be to him, why do you use these as examples when they've both failed?
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. That's interesting. All right. So there's a lot to talk about here. So that kind of sets the table for a discussion about Cuba. If that's what you want to talk about, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Or you can call in and talk about something else. But we have with us Robby Starbuck. He's with Latinos for Tennessee. He is running for Congress. He's running for Congress. But we're also talking about Cuba. So whatever you want to talk about. Take a break. Be back right after this.